Let's have some fun. Many of you are in the back, and I'm not sure why. I mean, feel free to kind of come up and populate up here to make it informal, because we're going to have a conversation that I hope is more like a dinner table conversation with three very, very interesting people with thoughts about this. But I'd like to get as many of you into this conversation before we go as well. So are America's counterterrorism partners dooming U.S.-led efforts to prevent the spread of violent extremism? I'm going to introduce our three guests in a moment, but I mean, is this just I'm sort of a yes or no answer will suffice, right? So, no, it won't suffice. We've got to go deeper. But let me tell you who we've got here. We have Ambassador Rick Barton, who is now a lecturer at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School of Public Policy, Public and International Affairs. Is it still the Wilson School? Get into that later. That's tomorrow's conference. Rick was also Assistant Secretary of State for Conflict and Stabilization Operations in the Department of State. He's held a variety of positions in the government. I happen to know when he was there. I'm fascinated by the question of the structure that supports diplomacy or that supports the aspiration of countries in the world, and hopefully we'll get into that. And then just to my right, we have Dr. Ella Manea, Associate Professor of the Institute of Political Science at the University of Zurich. She has research interests in legal pluralism in multicultural societies, gender and politics in Arab states, democratization in the Middle East, and so on. She is an expert in women's rights, and so hopefully we'll bring those dimensions, particularly with regard to the Middle East, North Africa region, into this. And then we have very, very strange man, interesting man, but it's strange. Stephen White is a freelance security sector consultant, owner-director of SSR Consultants. He was basically the chief of police in Northern Ireland and has very interesting frameworks. As I understand it, he's a very cool cop. He was... Prior to 2010, he served for 5 years as a special advisor to the European Union's Secretary General and as the head of mission for the EU's Integrated Rule of Law mission in Iraq. We were just talking in there that sometimes someone with police background and who has an understanding of counterinsurgency or the military dimensions or the police dimensions may be the right person to stand forward in an equation. Sometimes it's a human rights activist. And oftentimes, I think one of the interesting things is to looking at where the nexus between these are and how to do it. And he's someone, I mentioned strange because he really likes human rights activists, which many big cops don't. So I'm interested in that as well. But let me start out with Rick, because I think this question of are America's counterterrorism partners dooming U.S.-led efforts to prevent the spread of violent extremism, are we shooting ourselves in the foot in the way we're managing our relationships and setting up aspirations that we can't achieve with really crappy partners?
I would say that yes, we are. Dooming may be overstating it, but
that was Elisa's world.
But we're definitely hurting ourselves, and but it's not something new. In fact, we're probably more sensitive to it and actually minimizing it more aggressively than we have in the past in a lot of different ways. And one of the ways is with fairly honest reporting about what's going on. There's still a tendency for denial on the part of the United States sometimes in the countries that we're working in, but very much so on the part of our partners. I mean, they're much more inclined to say the reason we have terrorists in our country is because you have drone attacks or because of what you're doing in Afghanistan or because of your friendship with Israel, as if their responsibility was absent. And so it's so denial as usual, even though I'm from New England and we're really good at denial, denial as usual is not your ally in this kind of a situation. And so it starts with recognition that there are problems here. And like the Human Rights Report said about Nigeria, for example, I just looked at it in the last couple of days. The quote, impunity remained widespread at all levels of government. The government brought few persons to justice for abuses and corruption. Okay, well that doesn't sound like a perfect partner. Of the 5 leading countries of terrorism in the world right now, 4 of them are fairly strong U.S. allies: Iraq, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Nigeria. So we obviously have something going on there. And back to the short answer, yes.
So if you were Secretary of State, well, let's make you president and secretary. How would you shift it? Because the answer is always the issue of the tension between interests and transparent. I mean, it reminds me of Muammar Gaddafi. A lot of people don't remember the full Gaddafi story. Gaddafi's bad guy. We remember that. I visited Tripoli and I met part of his government, and at the time we were trying to normalize. And part of the price of his normalizing with us was that he jailed lots of jihadis going to fight us in Iraq in awful prisons. He executed some of these people. He gave up a nuclear weapons program. So I'm always interested in whether or not there's a tension between big interests, whether they sit on sort of a ladder of priority, and whether or not you forgive him being a bad guy to his people because he's, creating a public good by getting rid of nukes and by preventing the spread of some jihadis. How do you, within government, if you were to be in charge, would you balance those interests other than just say, wouldn't it be nice we had more nice guys around the world?
Yeah, well, I do think you have to go back to your core values, and any time that you are really contradicting one of your core values, you're probably going to produce a very negative long-term effect. Now, the question is whether it's in the next guy's watch, the next president's watch, or the next Secretary of State's watch, and I think we have pushed an awful lot of these problems down the road. I happen to believe that bad news does not get better with age. That's something that has been a principle that has worked for me, and I think it's a principle that works for a progressive country like the United States, that we generally realize if we do something really dumb today, we're probably going to pay the price later. So some of these, and if you have friends that you cannot be honest with, that's not a very good friendship. If you're constantly stifling so here we are with the UK. They have a problem in Northern Ireland. It's our closest ally in the world, and we have the United States president running political rallies in their capital. Now, if we can do that with our best friend, then it's conceivable that we could have a mature conversation. I remember when I was the Deputy High Commissioner for UNHCR, and I went down to Cote d'Ivoire, and I had to meet with the Minister of the Interior, Minister Bombay, and I was a UN official. I was not a US official. And I went in to see him and I said, I understand that the leader of the opposition is in prison. And that is something that concerns us because as the Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees, we find that that's the kind of imprisonment that leads to tens of thousands of refugees, and that's my responsibility. He spent 45 minutes lecturing me on how this guy was the son of a Burkinabe and so therefore couldn't be president and should be in jail. 45 minutes and telling me Kissinger couldn't be president, and so lecturing on American politics as well. But he was the first guy they threw in jail, and he stayed the longest when they got rid of that government. And then they had a war, and then they lost lots of people, and there were millions of refugees. So we've really got to be aware of our short-term acts cannot negate our long-term interests and vice versa. And that's a very delicate balance, but I don't think we've done it as skillfully as we could have.
Ella, let me ask you the same question. I know that you've written and thought a lot about how America ought to select its partners and how to get, what needles can be pushed. But again, coming at this question of how you would reframe things, how you look at the real tension points, what do you think we need to do that we're not doing today? And how would you weigh the different equities? Because when I look at the region that you're such an expert in, I just wonder if we took what Rick just put on the table and said we shouldn't shoot ourselves in the foot, we ought to work with, decent defenders of human rights, who would we work with in the Middle East? Who's there?
Yeah. It's a very good question, honestly. And at the same time, I can understand from a policy maker perception. It's like one would basically push for a realist approach. It's like our national interests, our national security, we have to protect them. But my argument is simple, is that it is in your national interests to look at the partners that you're engaging with. Because many in the region right now, with all due respect, and I come from this region, and I guess I'm speaking this way because I love this region, some of them are not exactly promoting the values that you claim to stand for. That's the first thing. The most important thing, why is it in your national interest? Look at Saudi Arabia and Qatar. They're promoting a certain kind of non-violent Islamism that provides the narrative for the violent Islamism and extremism that you're fighting. So you're fighting with them against something that they actually providing a basis for. And it's interesting this week to see what the Vice Chancellor of Germany said bluntly. For the first time, the time to look away is coming to an end. We're not going to look away in terms of Saudi Arabia, its financing of mosques, its financing of kind of like sectarian ideology that actually provide the basis for this extremism that we are all in the region are suffering from. That said, on the other hand, you see also certain partners who are pushing for a very aggressive foreign policy in the region that is destabilizing the region at the same time. And this destabilization is leading to a power vacuum. And this is being filled. Right now, in Yemen, my country of origin, you have 8 governments right now where you have certain kind of elements of Al-Qaeda and Daesh, ISIS, Islamic State, taken hold. Where you have vacuum, you have these groups coming to fill the vacuum. Now imagine a map where you have Sinai, where you have Syria, Iraq, Horn of Africa, and Yemen. And all of this filled with pockets controlled by the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. Do you think this will not come back and haunt you? And it will destabilize at the same time. That's the very important thing. What you have to do is also to talk with your partners. It's in your long-term interest. First of all, to crack down on this ideology and to have a straight record on human rights. Because it's not sustainable. That's the word. It's not sustainable.
Let me just ask real quickly, how do you get into and crack that relationship, let's say Wahhabist ideology? And you know, one of my concerns, and you see it in American politics today, you see it in Donald Trump's and comments and Ben Carson and others, and it's a pretty scary brown shirt style thuggery emerging where you know, if I agreed with you about Saudi fueling the Wahhabist ideology, the first thing you know, happens is people tend to Americanize that problem somewhat or westernize that problem and say that's our problem, as opposed to why isn't the Muslim world largely sorting that out and having other competing? In other words, why is it the US or European role to try to channel the Saudis in a different direction? Why not other adherents of those people that go to Mecca on this and have, you know, different? So I'm just sort of interested in, you know, to the tendency, because when it falls into the US or the Western European set of responsibilities, then you get the religious clash issue come up.
Yes.
It's not within a religion, it's between religions.
I guess I was responding to the question, are Americans counterterrorism partners dooming? Yes, they're doing that. They're doing that. Yes, they're doing that. So that's, I guess,
you're going to say no, right? So we have some diversity?
The other aspect, yes, of course, it's like from within the region, we have a responsibility. It's like we're not trying to outsourcing our problems to you.
Right.
Although that seems to be the case, you know, sometimes one has the impression. But the responsibility coming from within should be also supported from outside, you know? And it's just like we need leadership on different levels, from within the region, but also from European Union and the United States. And unfortunately, on this particular side, I don't see leadership, forgive me, from the side of the United States in this
Perhaps
issue.
I can come in at this
Yeah,
stage?
go ahead, Stephen.
First of all, I have to respond to the introduction. It's the first time I've been introduced as being strange.
Said with great love. Strange in all the good ways.
I'm taking it as a compliment because it is a great privilege to be here with Human Rights First. And the last couple of years I've worked with Elisa and her colleague Chris Beecroft on security sector reform, and in particular human rights issues in relation to police investigations and interrogations. Very important work. But when Elisa opened up the conference this morning, she talked about 3 things in the first 2 or 3 sentences of her introduction. She talked about leadership, she talked about partnership, and she talked about putting principles into practice. Now, that's really where I'm coming from. I'm a practitioner. Most of my adult life, I've worn a uniform or I've completed some role, either with the European Union or some other assignment, trying to help security services, whether it be police, military,
or the intelligence services. And there are three things that I believe are extremely important in terms of how we get a message across. Otherwise, we are doomed to failure. I've seen failures, I've seen semi-successes, and I've seen some outstanding successes.
Right.
And there are some common themes. And again, Ilham has mentioned the word leadership. And for me, it's always about early intervention, intervening as early as possible with the people who are going to be influential in due course. So that may be looking at leadership within the community. It may be looking at leadership within the political sphere, or it may be leadership within the security services. And let me say again, first and foremost, that I'm not a diplomat, I'm not a political scientist, but I do believe that foreign policy and I do believe that education play a very major role. But in terms of talking to those involved in dealing with terrorism and dealing with violent extremism, either trying to counter the narrative or trying to help young men, and it is mostly young men I've worked with, to escape, there are certain things that work and there are certain things that prevent things working. And that's first and foremost where I come from. What obstacles are there that are preventing things happening? It may be perception or it may be reality. And let me go right back to the Northern Ireland experience, if I may. And I understand some people are very weary of hearing about Northern Ireland. It wasn't a total success, but certainly the level of violence and the level of terrorism and extremism has been vastly reduced. And it was with the help of outside agencies and governments and funding, whether it be the Clinton administration, whether it was the European Union peace funds, whether it was the government of the UK or Republic of Ireland. It was a partnership approach at the macro level, but also at the micro level. And as a police officer, I remember feeling very, very strongly, and this gets back to the heart of how we deal with violent extremism or counterterrorism. I remember as a police officer feeling very, very hurt, very offended as one of the good guys whose colleagues were being slaughtered and as we tried to deal with terrorism. When the Labour government in 1996 produced a paper, it was their policy for Northern Ireland just before Tony Blair became Prime Minister. And on page 1 it said, there will never be peace in Northern Ireland until there's a police service that is trusted and supported by all the population.
So trust.
And on page 8 of the same document, it said there will never be a police service of Northern Ireland which is trusted and supported by all the community until the conflict has been resolved. Now, that used to drive me crazy. For at least 6 months to a year, it was a big debate amongst the police chiefs. Are we the blame? Are we the solution? Are we the problem? And the reality is, of course, it's both. It's like a gears in a gearbox. So some changes needed to take place, some reforms needed to take place within the security sector, within policing. But also there had to be some changes within the community and within politics. So it's somehow about harnessing those two things at the same time, because a lot of the countries that I work in now, they say, we can't change the police. First of all, public opinion would not want us to go soft. And anyway, we're fighting a war. We're fighting a war against her. So
transport yourself into Iraq or Afghanistan or some of the conflict regions that Rick and Ilham have been trying to think about. What lessons are most important in that? I mean, I find the question that you raised about trust to be a very complicated one when you have the kind of emissaries that we've been.
Of course it is, and even your jokey introduction at the start about being strange. Is it strange that a police chief should support human rights?
It shouldn't be.
When the whole ethos of policing is about protecting life. Right. That's what we exist to do. But we also find ourselves in conflict. We find ourselves in violent confrontations. We find ourselves working for our government or working for our international organizations. So it is very difficult. Building trust with your partners is extremely important, whether those partners be a country, and I've negotiated with prime ministers and presidents, I've negotiated with former terrorists, so I've had the whole spectrum of trying to gain trust. And I think it is, as a number of speakers have already said today, it's a putting your words into action. It's being meaningful in what you're saying, not just for the sake of appearances, and not just for finance, because a lot of countries that I've been involved in, they know you can provide funds. So therefore the trust is not so much meaningful as it should be. It's a case of, what are we getting out of it? So real meaningful trust, I think, takes time, and that's another lesson, dealing with violent extremism takes time. Old men like me with grey hair have been there, and the challenge is somehow trying to put older heads on younger shoulders. And that's where, if I dare say, I believe very strongly in this, which is strange for a cop to say perhaps, former terrorists, ex-combatants, ex-prisoners, they have a key role in this. And their voice is important. Now, that's very difficult for some people to listen to. But I work with former IRA people who have killed colleagues of mine. I've worked and engaged with former Al-Qaeda members working in the east of London who are trying to prevent young Muslim youths getting involved. I've also heard converted terrorists, and that's a difficult terminology to use, in places like Indonesia, being used or volunteering to help in the CVE world. So it's a very complex world. Things can happen at the macro level, but also at the micro level. At the individual level, it's extremely important.
So let me ask you to drill down into one thing and put you on the spot.
Sure.
On. I actually think that I introduced you on purpose that way because I actually find the model that you bring in the short time I've known you unusual, important, inspiring, interesting. And I'm interested in, I've met a lot of other people that deal with security provision in the world, but the frame that you bring, I think, is still relatively rare. Am I wrong? Or do you sense, say, on a scale of 1 to 10, how many people carry the frame that you have? And should that be an objective, which is really to look at people, the bond, creating a hybrid between the human rights dimensions and the civil society dimensions and those that are responsible for law enforcement. I mean, I got to tell you, I was just watching as we came into the blow up in Chicago right now.
Yes.
We have a problem inside this country on the same sort of issues. So how many carry your frame?
Well, I possibly am not unique, but relatively rare in the sense that I've had the privilege of being at the senior levels and being trusted to do international assignments. So from that point of view, I've been fortunate in the people that I've engaged with, both politically and, as I say, at the other end of the spectrum, former terrorists. But having said that, I think my life and the life of people around my age, my generation from Northern Ireland, in a sense reflects the learning that's come through Northern Ireland. As a young boy, I was the son of a police officer. I'm also the father of a police officer now, by the way. But as the son of a police officer who terrorists attempted to murder. So as soon as I was a teenager, old enough, I joined the army. Like the National Guard, part-time army, university by day, patrolling the streets at night, to fight in a military war against terrorism. But by the late 70s, early 80s, it was becoming a criminal justice issue. So it was about professionalising the police, giving them the resources, the training to fight the terrorists using the rule of law, complying with human rights, but getting the evidence to put people away. By the late 80s, it was becoming obvious. Policing alone, the security sector alone, will not deal with it. It has to be a community issue with international aid and support. So I don't think I'm unique in the sense that anyone who's gone through that journey, the politicians in Northern Ireland, even the leaders of the extreme groups, they've gone through that learning process. We want to share that lesson. So there are many Northern Ireland people sharing the lessons abroad. But in a sense, we're not saying, aren't we wonderful? Look what we did. We made so many mistakes. It took us so long. And my view is that it's a privilege to say to people in other countries, perhaps you need to look at some of the things we got wrong. Perhaps you need to look at some of the things we tried and were relatively successful. So from that point of view, I don't think the message is unique, but the point is, I suppose, getting it heard, listened to, and believed in. And I think that's the big challenge.
Go ahead, Rick.
Let me jump in on that for a second, if I could, because a lot of the countries that I've worked in, the conflict countries, really did not have fully professional police forces, or certainly, many didn't even have judges that could hold a trial. Or if there was a trial, you'd have to have witness protection for everybody, including the judges. I mean, there's the risk of actually having a system. But one of the things that we said early on was that we would go looking for a straight shooting sheriff and a circuit riding judge, if you could find one. And I always believed that when we went into Kenya before this last election in the State Department and CSO, we were told, you can't work with the police in Kenya. And it was like, I know there's at least one honest policeman in Kenya. We're going to work on that assumption. Of course, there were dozens in every place we went, and they were delighted to have an early warning system that was tied to the community, and they were delighted to have some kind of accountability that worked both ways. So these talents exist, but you've got to go looking for them. I remember meeting with a group of human rights activists in Sierra Leone, And they were 8 or 9 at a table, and they were bemoaning the fact that there had been no trials in a number of years in the country, basically, and no trials.
No trials at all.
No trials at all. So I said, how many of the judges in this country do you trust? And one of the young women at the table said 8. So then our immediate task, because one of the challenges for this panel is that, okay, what can you do immediately? These are long-term problems, but you can always do stuff tomorrow. You've got to get started on it. Was, okay, let's pick 1 or 2 of those 8 and make it possible for them to hold some trials. Because if there's some trials being held, you will not run into the phenomena that we found in Afghanistan, which was when we surveyed the public, they thought that the Taliban was providing more justice than the Afghan government. Now, if you're coming in second to the Taliban on justice, you're probably not at the head of your class.
Elama, I want to come to you, but I want to ask you one question structurally, Rick. Would you work with these groups in capacity building directly, or would you work through NGOs that were engaged in civil society capacity building? All of the above.
Yeah.
So it would be a different in circumstance. Okay.
Totally opportunistic.
Elham?
I just want to connect with what you were basically discussing, because coming back to the issue of responsibility, taking responsibility from within each state in the region. Right now I'm talking back to the region. You're talking about the police force, the importance of the role of the police force, and that they also should integrate concept of human rights in their work, in the conduct. Now, in a context where you have sectarian strife, like in Bahrain, for instance, you have a big issue not only with the police service or forces, but also with the security services. Right. And because if you look, you will see also the sectarian dimension there is playing a big role. You have members who have been naturalized.
Right.
Yes.
From Syria, from Yemen, from Pakistan, who were only naturalized because of their sectarian affiliation with with the Sunni Islam. And you can imagine how, in one way or another, their conduct towards the majority of the Shia population within Bahrain will reflect also on how they treat them. There's also lack of trust. And that should be remedied. In a Yemeni context, just basically to flip the coin, you see that during the period of Ali Abdullah Saleh, the former president, the whole army was based on this kind of sectarian. You know, certain regions, Sanhan, that was basically over-representative within the national army, the security service. And from that perspective, you have a large segment of population who feel we cannot trust you. You don't represent us. You're a bodyguard for certain sectarian, regional, tribal interest. Now, I will never underestimate the importance of the ideology that we're fighting, because it's a very important factor. It's an ideology, and we have to fight it. Also, with a counter kind of ideological kind of narrative.
So freeze there.
But on the other hand, it's very important to mention that you have also certain kind of fertile ground for dissatisfaction. For people why did the Bahraini movement, the uprising, turned into a sectarian dimension? Because it turned into a sectarian dimension. You see a certain kind of
this raises a really interesting question. This summer, I happened to interview George Mitchell and Anne-Marie Slaughter and former Foreign Minister of Jordan, Marwan Muwashir. I don't know if anyone was there in Aspen and saw this, but in short form, Marwan was saying, we have important trends going on. We would love to have your advice, your counsel, but get out of the middle of it because you can't solve it. Anne-Marie Slaughter was of the sort that these challenges, these human rights issues, what's happening and unfolding, demand our involvement, engagement, and oftentimes intervention. And George Mitchell was saying, the problem's so deep, so sectarian, so religious, solve it and call us in 400 years when it's over. And I don't mean it facetiously, but you've actually defined the way in such that when I think about the challenges for, say, the United States, I think largely, not everyone, we sort of like a kind of secular balance with religion, where everyone has a place, where you have minority rights, where you have women's rights, and so those deeper obsessions and impulses are somehow balanced with a secular order. I think that's one of the things that America tries to promulgate. But you just define a thing where both sides in this largely to subscribe to something that's not there at all in the Sunni Shia. Maybe in the UAE, it's some semi-authoritarian, secular Sunni, state or something of the sort. But I'm interested in whether or not this third way exists and what our role is, because as you just described it, I don't know where that leaves U.S. policy. And going back to our first question of what our choices are between shooting ourselves in the foot, what is the choice of is it walking away and not shooting at all, or is it shooting ourselves in the head? Like, how do you balance those?
You can't walk away, because when you walk away, it will come back and hunt you, like it or not, with all due respect. Okay, but while I'm sorry,
Please finish.
But while this is the case, I would just emphasize these are the roots of the problems, and the lack of a separation between state and religion, the lack of a basis where you can respect every citizen, female, male,
right,
regardless. They have their own space and place in this society respected. Mm-hmm. Seems utopian, but to me, that's the road to solve the problems that we have in the region. But to come to terms with this, you also have to recognize you have voices in the region, men and women working hard to try and to change these situations, mm-hmm, reform them, and they shouldn't be left in the cold.
Rick, real quick, and Stephen.
I agree. I think the United States role. The United States has a role whether we like it or not, but then whether we overplay our role has been a chronic mistake. I think that we should be catalytic in these places. We have universal human rights. We believe in essentially freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom of assembly. If those three freedoms are working, a lot of other freedoms are going to thrive. You don't run into a human being anywhere on earth who says they'd like to give those three things up. So it's pretty well accepted. And so that's the ideal we're moving to. But our role is to be catalytic. I'm a parent. And I thought the best advice I ever got as a parent was that you put your arms around your child and then you cross your fingers. Mm-hmm. Okay? and that's the way I feel about these places. It doesn't get, why should I have a more intimate relationship with a country that I barely know than I would with my own child? So it's a good framework for understanding that you have a responsibility, but you prefer not to have the kid still living at home at 50, at 55, at 65, or whatever age it is.
I'd like to come in and
Stephen,
just make a few comments, because without trying to simplify things, I believe there's a checklist. If you're trying to create a reform, whether it be in an organization or a country or a police department, or security services, there are a number of things you need to look at. And Elisa mentioned again in your opening few sentences this morning about the need for a vision, an agreed vision. But a vision's not just enough. We need to have a plan to get there. The plan has to be based on principles. And you need political will to drive that. You need community involvement. You need resources, whether it be funding or skills. But as well as all those things, including legislation to make it happen, you need leadership. And this, I think, is always the vital part. And I'm sorry for dwelling on it, but it's something really I feel very passionate about. If you're expecting cultural change, and you reminded me of it, in my own country, during the 70s, there was a sort of hierarchy of how we deal with terrorism or CVE. It's the intelligence services first, the MI5, the MI6, your equivalent, the CIA or whatever. You then have the military, mm-hmm, and then you have the police, but it's the special branch, the secret police, those that deal with counterterrorism. And you work your way down, and the poor cop at the bottom, the neighbourhood cop, was the one at the bottom. What we've tried to do is invert that, mm-hmm, triangle or pyramid, mm-hmm, through good leadership, cultural change. The community guy or woman who's in uniform, who knows the community, who's working with the neighbourhoods, they are as important, if not more important, than those who are dealing with national security. National security has a ring about it, it has a myth about it that, in my opinion, allows certain things to happen which shouldn't happen. Whereas the uniformed police officer cannot avoid what's happening. And again, without wanting to comment on what's going on in the States, I feel very sad when I see some of the things that have happened when I've been in USA, in Ferguson, or wherever the case may be. I'm not commenting in a derogatory way, but to me, there are some obvious things that need to be addressed.
But see, let me just make it practical for me. I mean, there are a couple of frames. Turkey, Egypt.
Yes.
If I think about Iraq and Ramadi, where you've got Shiite militias have moved in with the support of the Iraqi government to try and deal with ISIS, take back. It's the same Shiite militias that 2 years ago came into town and murdered family members of Sunni politicians in Baghdad. So the level of trust doesn't exist. So when I think about, one, a crazy situation inside Iraq, or I think about, Turkey and Egypt, in which you have strong leadership. In one case, I tell you, U.S. policy under that wasn't under Jim Glassman, but when Jim Glassman was the Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, he looked at his vision in the world as not trying to make the world love America. He looked at his vision of how do you get young people in the Middle East, North Africa region to get politically engaged and not grab guns. And so that was largely the precursor to Egypt. Then you see the kids that got politically active, basically killed, shot, or jailed for being Muslim Brotherhood members. So I'm interested in how you go from your experience into a practical application into tough zones where I don't know how you get there. And I'd love all three of you, before I go to the audience, to respond to that.
Let me be very practical. It doesn't get much more practical than this. A lot of my life I spent working with the army, working with the police in very nitty-gritty, difficult situations. In the UK police, you must join as a police constable. So we all have to rise to the top through going through all the ranks. So you can't avoid engaging in conflict, shall we say. I think that allows me as a police officer and people like me to go to Egypt, to go to Turkey and say, look, with the experience I have, and I'm not soft, I have a brain, I have experience, let me tell you something about the efficacy of things like torture.
Right.
Or the overuse of force, albeit legal force, but that's unproportionate, it's unjustified, and so on. Let me tell you what works.
Or change from within.
But it's also, for example, 2 months ago I was in Malta with a human rights colleague, human rights first colleague, and we were explaining to a number of African representatives from the judiciary and from the senior police command that there are other ways in which you can get information. There are other ways in which you can investigate as opposed to torture. Not only does it have the professional, what's the word I'm looking for? The confidence. It builds your own skills and the competency and the confidence that comes with solving a case and not having to torture. Because anyone who tortures, it has an effect on them, of course. So you're actually opening their eyes to something that works. Let me give you one final example. Accountability. In my lifetime as a police commander, I've had the duty to authorise the use of force. Not firing lead bullets, but firing plastic bullets. And that causes injury, thankfully not death. We now have an independent police ombudsman in Northern Ireland that was resisted by the police, and it was supported by human rights groups. And a lot of police was, why do we want someone outside who doesn't understand the police to investigate us, to whom we'll be accountable? And there are lots of different accountability mechanisms, policing boards and so on. It is now part of our training, I'm no longer a police officer, it is now part of the training that before you even implement an operation, you have to give your plan for independent oversight, which will include things like your human rights strategy, your officer protection strategy, your use of force strategy, your incarceration strategy or arrest strategy, and of course use of firearms. Quite often that has proved to the police officer's benefit. After the event, they will say, they did try to consult, or they did consult. They did take alternative action. They did use proportionate, justified legal force, and so on. So I'm not saying it's only a police officer can convince a police officer, but quite often a police officer in partnership with human rights groups can communicate and get a message over in a way that is understood by other cops because it works.
Fascinating. Noted. Elam and Rick, why don't you tell me how you would approach, say, a Turkey or an Egypt, which are allies in a way, but have their own form of it. I asked Condoleezza Rice at Aspen, did she worry? I mean, it's not a popular name maybe here, but I said, do you worry about young people that basically decided to get politically engaged being sort of shoved under the rug again? And she said, they will come back. It will create a new cycle of violence. So I'm interested in how you would balance both of these, and then we'll go to the audience real quick.
Oh, go ahead. I don't know. I don't have an answer.
Neither do I.
I mean, it's a really good question. I tend to, again, try to look at something that might have an impact in the near term,
right,
as well as fits within the longer scenario. And I do think that we're missing a lot of communications opportunities. That one of the advantages of youth markets is that they tend to be highly communicative.
Right.
And so when we're inserting middle-aged Washington, let's kindly say diplomats as opposed to bureaucrats, into the equation, we're probably missing something. I happen to think that what we did at CSO at the State Department in Syria, where we helped to start 11 independent, Syrian-led, content-filled radio stations for the first time in really their modern history, that took a high degree of trust on our part. We could have easily ended up with a couple of those stations being somewhat irresponsible. But I felt that that having them expressing their voice and speaking to their people in their way and making fun of their elected officials or supporting them or whatever it happened to be was going to be preferable to the pattern they were on. So there are a lot of ways of engaging people and making them responsible for their own lives. And that's really what we're looking at, whether you're doing it in the criminal justice system. You can't just say, I'm going to build a new law school, I'm going to provide new books, we're going to have a new constitution. All this stuff is quite wonderful, but you also have to give people some sense of daily justice, that there's an improvement, there's reason to hope that the sacrifice they're making, because they're the ones that are living with it every day. I can always come back to wherever I am. So that tends to be the core principle that I'm looking for. The other thing on the Turks and the Egyptians that I would say is that, particularly the Turks, I mean, they're a really important ally. They're a member of NATO. And I can't tell you how many times they were playing a double game. So, I mean, hey, do we agree on what we're trying to do here? And because if we don't agree, then everything we're doing is going to be negated by what you're doing. And there's an awful lot of that going on. And I happen to think the president has worked hard on that and tried to get people to step up to that line. But we've indulged these local nuances or habits for a long time. And it's hard for people to come out of that practice.
But it does get at that cycle of shooting ourselves in the foot. I mean, right now I'm worried about journalists throughout the region, being jailed.
I mean, the Turks with journalists, I mean, it's a terrible, terrible policy. And by the way, we get better information from the journalists than we generally get from our intelligence, because they're out there, they're everywhere.
Fascinating. Ellen, then we'll go to the audience.
You said you don't have an answer to this,
No.
So it's like and honestly, I seem to also I find it difficult. The question itself is like, you expect to solve the problems of the world, you can't. First, okay? But in order to engage with allies, these allies also have a responsibility to act in a way that reflect the common objectives, and they're not doing that. And from that perspective, if I talk about Egypt, I mean, it should be a common sense to the leadership within Egypt that this course of oppression is bound to backfire. Come on, it's going to backfire. And it's not only a kind of like a political kind of uprising I'm worried about. It's also with the economic kind of like factors. It's like the uprising of the hunger. Mm-hmm. It's like, as one is right now, one has to listen to what people are saying in the streets. So from that perspective, without taking responsibility for my own future, my own country, my own people, I really don't see how we can basically proceed in such a partnership. I don't know.
Rick? I had a chance to do a rather intense study of U.S. assistance to Pakistan. And that was a very, that was a monorail relationship that we had.
What do you mean by that?
Well, as long as we got along with the military and the intelligence service, that was what we thought our interest in Pakistan was. So over time, we maybe alienated 95% of the Pakistani public. A big number, considering that we were at that point spending about $2 billion a year in the country. So the average American thinks $2 billion that we can be friends. But the average Pakistani says, you're not doing anything that matters to me. And so that was a bit of the old-fashioned relationship, that we had a very narrowly defined interest. We thought we had some officials that would sort of keep that working. They were essentially two-faced as well. And then we end up at the end with virtually nothing to show for it, for a significant effort. So I think we don't want to repeat that, and yet that's the pattern and that's the program. That's kind of the beat that we've been on. And I happen to think that President Carter enriched the conversation a lot when he elevated the concept of human rights into being a Central American interest. And nobody has been able to quite duck it, although people are still trying to undermine it and question whether it's tough enough or whatever.
Fascinating conversation. I mean, I agree with you. I mean, I actually agree with all three of you in the different frames, although I pretend to think differently sometimes. But I think a lot of the discussions, unfortunately, in the U.S. government, where you see us doing something good out there in the human rights, in my friendly critique, is often a fig leaf for other things. Or unsustained or inconsistent.
Right.
And it reminds me, I don't know how many of you have experience with Cuba, but after the Kashmir, Pakistan earthquakes, I think in 2005, Cuba sent so many doctors to this area. And one of the interesting challenges that very deeply Islamic, devoutly Islamic region, they had a lot of male doctors, not a lot of female doctors. They had some, but they had to dress. I went down and interviewed some of the doctors, and they dressed as women to be able to treat and help the women that were there. The Cubans had 17 base camps there for a full year. The current foreign minister of Cuba ran the operation and was on site for the full year when he was there. The U.S. and the British had single base camps, and the imprint was short-lived, something like 6 or 7 weeks. And it just makes, not to celebrate Cuba over all things, so they've got their own human rights, but it raises the interesting question about when you're trying to reach a people and trying to send a different signal that's a little bit less shooting yourself in the foot, what does it take in terms of changing the frame, reaching people as opposed to intelligence operations, and kind of having a different operation? But this has been very rich. Let me open to all of you in the few minutes, 10 minutes we have, and have more of a conversation. Sorry, this one we became so self-intoxicated with how cool we were. But yes, right here. Oops.
I think they're raising their hands to say they were here.
Yes, go ahead, right in the back. We have a microphone. We apparently have 40,000 people watching live online now.
Oh, yes, I believe you.
Hi, my name is Olivia Horowitz. I'm from the Baldwin School outside of Philadelphia.
Cool.
Earlier you mentioned the relationship between violent extremism and the lack of separation between state and religion. So my question is, do you believe that the secularism of the United States counterterrorism partners undermines or bolsters that country's ability to prevent violent extremism?
Rick, thoughts?
I'm not absolutely sure that I got the question. So could you rephrase it?
I think that the question is, does America's sort of secularism and partners with counter-terror partners undermine our efforts with places that have largely sectarian, less secular, more religious blocs?
Yeah, I think we have it. I think we have, in our foreign policy, we've been determinedly sort of a-religious. So because we have the separation here in this country of faith and government, which really works for us, we then take that rather clean principle to our foreign policy, and actually what it produces that's, I think, more harmful than our aligning with one side or the other is actual ignorance of religion, which is not one of our principles. I mean, so I do think that we need to be much, much more informed, much more aware of the incredible religion religious pressures that exist in places, and our policy is just getting to that now. We have a tiny office in the State Department that kind of drives that. But if you ask a typical embassy, what are you doing with religious leaders? Well, I met with a cardinal, or I met with an imam or something, but they don't, there's not that deep knowledge that you have to have.
Quick thoughts?
Well, I think I always see things, I guess, from the perspective from within. Okay? So from that perspective, I think it's one of the major problems within the region is this lack of separation between religion and state. So from that perspective, with all due respect, it's like you have certain values which I consider universal values. Defend them. Defend them, you know. But while saying that, and I understand from a foreign policy perspective, you are supposed to approach the word sensitivity. You've always mentioned it several times in our discussions, and it's very important. It's like respect sensitivity, but don't compromise on certain kind of core values that I consider important. Why do we have all of these problems in many Arab countries and Islamic countries? As a Pakistan, for instance. I'm sorry, it's just like...
I definitely don't want to suggest that I'm compromising on our values here, but I do think that it's hard to play an informed role on the issue of religion unless you start with an understanding of it and a much fuller understanding of the society that you're working in. And of course, our belief in, I mean, if you have those basic freedoms that I mentioned earlier, then there's plenty of room for religious practices of all kind, because generally that's assembly speech and
I didn't mean this basically to suggest that you meant it that
Stephen?
way.
Just a very quick comment. As most people know, the Northern Ireland conflict was wrongly described quite often as a religious sectarian-based conflict, and I think we've learned to move away from that and look at the actual grievances. What are the grievances that feed the extremism or the fundamentalism or the anti-state behaviour, criminal or terrorist? And it's somehow trying to separate while at the same time respecting people's faith and religion. But basically, again, look at what are the problems and how can we address them?
I mean, I think that's a very important comment, that very often the notion of a grievance map is looked at as an immoral thing to consider, in the sense that looking at what may be driving, you know, when you think about terrorism, I got in a lot of trouble for this piece. I said terrorism is like a stage performance in a way, because you're trying to appeal and look legitimate in the eyes of some aggrieved audience. And American strategy at that time was to try to kill performers on the stage, not steal the audience. And I think your comment is a very important one, because it does take you to sort of put yourselves into the mindset of other people struggling with those issues. But I appreciate the question very much. You know, and I think we're going to go a little bit, like 5 more minutes.
One right at the back.
Yes, right in the back.
Hello, I'm Jay Kansar. I'm with the Hindu American Foundation. I was actually surprised to see that Pakistan and even Bangladesh were not included in this list, considering the concentration of population.
What list?
Yes, in the Muslim world, I would say that actually the Muslim world is primarily in South Asia.
No, but my question is, what list?
Oh, the list that you have right here: Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, in the description of the.
Well, we ignored that because we talked about Pakistan a little bit up here. But go ahead.
Sure. Well, I traveling to the region and working with our religious minority partners in the region, they feel that the U.S. has quite often abandoned them in their quest for political enfranchisement. So my question is, why is U.S. policy not more aggressive in ensuring political enfranchisement of religious minorities who are suffering from religious extremism on a daily basis? And they have been since the birth of these countries, and it's even sadder in Bangladesh, which was born as a secular nation, but soon demised into sectarian.
It's a great question, and I think it really also talks about American capacity for the kind of outreach you've just described. And there may, you know, in my view, there may be structural reasons for that, what you perceive as abandonment, but we won't go there. But do you sense that the dynamic of U.S. outreach to minorities, empowerment minorities, and it's large, I mean, let me put, you do women's rights. I mean, America is very robust, I think, in raising the question of women's rights, but are there other elements of minority political participation, minority religious representation that we've walked away from over time, Rick?
Sure we have, or we just didn't have that optic. We just didn't have, that wasn't the way we addressed the problem. But I think that, for example, one of the reasons that I would say that Hillary Clinton was a very successful Secretary of State is that she looked at half the world in a different way than anybody else had in that job. And so empowering half the world is a pretty significant achievement. And that's what it takes. I think really we've had a number of American presidents who have made certain religious minorities have been aware of their issues, and clearly we have a tremendous number of Congress people who pursue Christian minorities almost anywhere in the world right now. They champion them, and that's how they've gotten involved in certain countries, in their interests in certain countries. But I think the broader American public and the professionals in the State Department don't really have a great knowledge about many of these groups that you're talking about, and it starts with knowledge before you're probably going to get much action.
I want to make a very quick point, and I'm sorry if this sounds like sloganizing, but it's something that was said to me, and I've never forgotten it. It's something which is at the local or parochial level, which I think can be extrapolated to the more macro or national level or international level, which may apply. And that is based on the principles of community policing or partnership or engaging with people. You need to know the people you need to know before you need to know them. And what happens quite often is we look for partners when it's too late, when the damage has already been done, when you're looking for the community representative or the religious leader or someone to bail you out when the problem's already got too serious. And therefore, whether it be national partners, international partners, local partners, I think the mapping, the relationship building has to begin as early as possible. And that's all part of the countering the violent extremism, countering the terrorism or criminality for that matter. So it really is important that partnerships and engagement takes place as much as possible at all levels.
Thoughts?
I actually agree with you that there's a certain kind of disengagement when it comes to religious minorities' plight in different contexts. Perhaps, and that again, I have to come back again. It's like, let's look at it, at all of this as something that we are collectively involved in, you know. You see right now certain kind of alliances, and I learned that in my field work in South Africa, where I was connected with the activists who worked during the anti-apartheid period. And one thing they emphasized to me all the time was basically make alliances. Look at the common grounds. And this is something that has become part of my work and others in the region. We are making alliances with different groups. It's never religious in nature, but across religious boundaries, where we basically find what do we want together for our region, for all of these countries. And we find that we would like to have a state that respects us all regardless.
There's a saying, if I may, and I'm sorry again if this sounds very trite, but it's very serious. It was a message which we in the police were asked to accept and eventually articulate, and that is policing is too important to be left to the police alone. So for me, countering violent extremism is too important to be left to the experts alone. And whether it's alliances at the national defence level, whatever, or at the neighbourhood level, it's extremely important that we don't think the specialists know best, because the answer is probably within the community.
I just want to say we're right near the end of our time, for which I apologize, but yeah, it's a very thoughtful and important question you posed. And one of the reasons why I classify myself as a realist, a progressive realist, but I'm not shy about it. And you know, I think we need to look at the world as it is, but also look at where we want to go. And I think your question is important because I think if you thought about all of the groups around the world, I specialize in sort of international relations at a higher level of analysis, is that much of the world feels abandoned by the United States, that much of the world looks at the United States as in strategic contraction, as distracted by other issues. And it creates really interesting problems because even your allies don't think you'll be there when you need them, so their behavior changes. Your enemies are moving their agendas. Groups within societies that felt like America was the creme de la creme democracy feel abandoned in a lot of areas. And it's one of the reasons why I love organizations like Human Rights First, because that gap, that void, has to be bridged by other institutions, at least for this period. I'm not sure that the US is really in strategic contraction. I have no doubt that the perception is there. And so perception really matters in that calculus of whether or not, and I tell people power in the world, or what you're perceived to be able to do, is very much a function of what people think about the future. It's like the stock market. If they think Google's going to continue to grow like crazy, it could be a small little entity and growing like crazy and priced way high. That's the way people used to look at China. China's real means, its real defense and economic capacity, rather modest. But China got a premium today on the fact that people thought it would be super powerful tomorrow. And I think that's one of the questions that I want to just throw out there as something to think about when you look at America abandoning or not abandoning various groups, is that phenomenon that you're feeling and sensing in that silo is something that's happening across a ton of silos right now. And that's a challenge, and that's why groups like Human Rights First. So I want to thank very much Ambassador Rick Barton from Princeton University, Elam Manea of the University of Zurich, and Stephen White from SSR Consultants, and a really cool cop that we hope his model and hybrid is less rare. But thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I'll take that.
All right. What a way to wrap up. That was terrific. Thank you so much, Stephen, to all of the panelists. And thanks to all of you for hanging in. I hope you found today's discussions as vital and productive as I did. If any of the past summits are the judge, the connections that we made here today, the discussions that we had will lead to action, which in turn will lead to progress. We'll be reaching out to many of you in the coming weeks and months as we continue our efforts to build broad-based consensus behind solutions to these pressing human rights problems. And I encourage you to reach out to us if you'd like to team up. Building partnerships, that's what we do at Human Rights First. So we're all about it. Please be in touch. Some of you I'll see tonight at the Beacon Prize Dinner where we'll be honoring Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy. I look forward to seeing those of you there and for the rest of you in the days ahead. Thank you so much.